So in this video, I'm going to give a quick demonstration of a technical risk-based approach to technical web testing. So I'm using a couple of words in there. Technical, which to me means technology-based, driven by the technology, not necessarily a technique-based thing. And risk-based, so I'm going to try and focus in on the risks that I see. So you're going to also see a modeling process, because I can't really target risks unless I have a model within which to identify those risks. So I have chosen to use the Orange HRM system, which is open source. I've downloaded a virtual machine from Turnkey. Here's the virtual machine running so that I can connect to it. So let me close those down. I'm using VirtualBox, slightly out of date, but that's fine. So if you needed to, you could download the VM and run it, and you could do this thing. So I've logged in as admin. On the employee list, I've created a user. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to edit that user. Now, what we do when I'm doing technical testing is I need to model the application. So at this point, the technology that I can see is the GUI front end. So if I edit this, I can remove that, and then that flagged up as required. Now, that's probably because of JavaScript. That's my hypothesis. I'm assuming that that's JavaScript. I'm going to try and validate that by looking in here. It's just a text type. There's nothing marked as mandatory there, but I can see that the max length. So I have learned that the validation there is not from HTML, it's actual JavaScript validation. So my assumption is that there are event handling on here. I can see the little EV. That doesn't look like any of those would particularly be the event handling. Keyboard stuff. Maybe I don't particularly like the event handling display in Firefox, but here we go. So I can see clicks and focus. Now the reason I'm using Firefox, I just said I don't particularly like the event handling display in Firefox. Why am I using Firefox then as my browser for technical web testing? Surely I want to use the most effective tools that I can. The reason is that I like Firefox in terms of controlling it to go through a proxy. So I've got the proxy set up here to allow me to go through BurpSuite proxy, which I'll show you in just a second. So whilst I don't like it for some parts of testing, I do prefer it for others. Simply because Chrome is my main browser, so I tend to use that with lots of plugins and things. I could probably use Epic and feed that through a proxy and then get the Chrome experience, but then I'm not necessarily testing on the right thing. But the tools we use are important. We use them for different reasons, even though they have differences. So we have here this, and I'm assuming that's JavaScript validation. I can check a little bit by going into the network traffic. So I can go, okay, so type in Alan, I can't see any network traffic there. I'll take that away. It says required. I'll try and save. I'm not seeing any network traffic going through there. So I think that's all happening in the browser. That's my assumption at the moment. But I can see that the only things that are listed here as mandatory are the name and the first name and the last name. So presumably if I put that in and save it, then did that URL get updated? Employee list, view employee list, edit, employee number, edit, Alan, save. Yeah, so the URL changed there when I did that. So let me have a quick look in here. Inspect element. I can see the form is going to that. The navigation was that. Okay, so we're building up a little picture. Now if I was doing this properly, I'd make notes on this so that I could see exactly what was happening. The reason I'm not making a lot of notes is because we're videoing it and because all the traffic's going through a proxy here. So at a technical level, I can view the GUI, which is the rendering, which is a representation of the HTML. I can view the HTML if I want by going in view source. I can see the DOM representation of the HTML by looking in the inspector here, and that gives me information about what is happening. But in order for me to understand this, I have to understand HTML. I have to understand how forms work. I can see that this is going to do a post method when submitted to this URL, which is different from the one that we navigated to when we came through the edit. All of this is useful information to me in terms of building this up. I saw a behavior where it looked like it was validating so fast that it was probably in the browser. I checked the network traffic, so I have to realize that when we are making calls to a web server, we're making them over HTTP. It's not magic. There's HTTP calls. I can view those in here so I can see what is working. Now, I haven't paid a lot of attention to the traffic, but I can see things like holiday years and work weeks. I don't know what that is yet because I haven't built a model, so I don't know how appropriate that is, how important that is for the testing that I'm doing here. But if I just focus in on the saving and editing here, if I edit this, I'm going to edit my name to Alan G, save that. So I can see here that we did a post request. And then I can come in here, I can actually see so I can see that the response has no body. If I look in the headers, I can see that the response is actually a location, which means it's a redirect. So, and I can see the request that's going in here, that's the headers. So there's the parameters being sent in as the message. So I can see that there's a response going in here. I can see the data that I've sent, which is fine. But at this point, I really want to drop down a level because I know that we've got JavaScript validation here. What I'm concerned about as a risk is perhaps the JavaScript validation is not the same as the server-side validation. But in order for me to test the server-side validation, I have to bypass the front end. There's a couple of ways I could do that. I could switch off JavaScript in here, and potentially I could inspect the elements and change the values. Perhaps then it might let me send in stuff that is empty. So I guess I have to edit that first, then save it. So it's come up as invalid there. So I can't quite bypass that way. In order for me to really bypass that, what I want to do is I want to go down to the HTTP level. So here I've got a proxy. This is all the requests that I've sent through. I know that what we've done there is send through a post request. So there's a post request. There's the details that I'm expecting. If I need to, I can view them in a very similar style that is coming through in the network tab here. So I can see the message. And then I can start working at a much lower level. So that message there didn't get sent through because it was invalid, but this one did. So let me try, and I'm just going to try and resend this. So if I do send to repeater, let me edit the name back to Alan because we're currently Alan G. Go. So here what's come back is the refresh. So it's actually two types of refresh. And so we've got the location header and we've got a refresh in here just in case the location header doesn't work, I guess, not sure why. Now if I refresh this URL, so I can see my name is back to Alan. So I just made the HTTP request into the system. Now the reason I've left the network tab still here is I don't know exactly what other requests are being made. It gives me a chance to view them, but I'm going to get rid of that and just focus in on the form and the messages being sent back and forward. So one of the risks here then is the validation is different on the server side than the front end. So one of the things we know from the front end is that the name has to be there. So if I take the name out and then send the request and refresh, we can see that the server didn't accept that. But what's interesting here is this is a very different response. This is not a redirect response. So when I sent in information that was invalid, I get a web page back, which is different from the actual thing that happens when I'm doing the main page. So what I need to do then is I really want to simulate that in the GUI to see what actually happens, because that doesn't seem right. Anytime what I'm doing is I'm building a model. What we saw is when I send a request from here and it's valid, we get a refresh request back. when I edit the message in the proxy and send it through, I'm not getting a refresh back, I'm getting an actual page. I want to know what happens when that's in the browser to see if this is a problem. At the moment, all I know is there's a difference. Anytime there's a difference, I start to get concerned, because that means I've gone through a different path through the application, and I have to spot the clues that come back to tell me that's happened. So this is quite a big clue, in the sense that we've got a response here, but we're getting a refresh here. So that is very different. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to put the intercept on. So in the options here, I've got an interceptor set up for any post request. So I'll switch the intercept on here. Then in here, I'll send through Alan again. The message has been intercepted here, so I'm going to change that to be the invalid one, which has got no details. Oops. Then I'll forward that. So what happened? So this is the page that came back. Doesn't look like there's any real difference, except that the URL is very different. This is the URL that was on the form. If I refresh this, I don't get a page, because that URL is for posting, not for getting. Whereas if I edit it normally and save that, we get a redirect back to this page, and the URL is different. So we've seen a different behavior. When we start working at the technical level, we'll start to see different behaviors than working at the GUI. I don't know if that's a problem or not. I just know that it's different, which then means there's something happening at the back end. Now, I don't have, with the level of information that I have about this system, the knowledge to know what is happening. So at this point on a project, I might want to go and speak to someone or look at the code to identify what is happening under the covers to know if this is a problem. What I'm not doing, because my level of observation is only going so far. I'm observing HTTP traffic. So I've got an observation on the front end, got observation on the traffic. I do not have any observation on the server. I do not know what is happening on the server. I'm not monitoring any logs on this virtual machine that is running here. I have no insight into that. So my technical testing is limited to the model that I've got, which is at a much higher level. Really, I should be trying to observe the system itself and see if there's any information in the logs, see what is happening down there. But I'm not doing that. So that's one thing we have to be aware of when we do technical testing, the limitations of our observation abilities, the limitation of our manipulation abilities, because we can probably always go further, and that might give us more information if necessary. All right, so now we know that there is a way of triggering different paths. So potentially, so that notion in my head of there's a risk that when we send in different types of messages, there's a risk that something can go wrong in the back end. That seems like a real risk to me now. So I want to concentrate in on that in more detail. So the obvious things to try are look for differences in validation. And at that point we come to functional testing as well. So I know that there's limits in terms of the characters that can be accepted here. I know that there's only 30 characters that can go in here. Let me just double check that. So I'm using a CounterString generator that I've written in JavaScript. So I'm going to generate 30. Let's copy that. Edit this. Put in 30. Now, that doesn't look like a very sensible name, but the system doesn't care. So we don't have any validation that this is a valid name. Maybe it's feasible that we can do that. But the max length name is 30. Now you can see we've got a rendering issue over here. What would be interesting is, I don't know if that's because there's no breaks in here or because that's how it will always be rendered. So let me just, so what you just see there is I almost got distracted, right? Because I'm not writing things down as I test, I almost got distracted away from my path. My path that I'm doing at the moment is the length and how important that is to name, but I almost got distracted into, well, what is that like rendering? And because if I followed that distraction path, what would happen is I'd remove this, put a space in, then see whether oh look, so the rendering issue is only because it's got 30 characters. When it's split into multiple things, the rendering issue goes away. That's fine, but I didn't really want to follow that path, and it's something we have to be aware of when we're doing exploratory testing. If we get distracted down certain paths, we need to make sure we're keeping a log so that we can come back to the path that we're on, because the path that I was focused on was the risk around the name length being different. So I know that 30 is acceptable in here. I know that if I try and put in more, I can't, but that's at an HTTP, that's at an HTML level. What I'm going to do is at a technical level, I'm just going to change that. So let me say max value 35. So now I should be able to put in 35 in there. Yep, so I've hacked about with the front end now to bypass the HTML level validation. Let's see if there's any JavaScript validation. There's no JavaScript validation, but look what we've just seen. I don't know if you've noticed. The URL is back to that error URL. It's not the one with employee/1. So presumably this was caught on the server side. We already know we've modeled the behavior on the server side. So clearly there's validation around this. Let me just double check. So it should only have come back with 30, which it has. So I'm finding this interesting. It means I don't actually have to test that behavior at the HTTP level, because I was able to test that behavior at an HTML level. I could have simply come in here. Where's that message? There it is with the 35. I could have done it at an HTTP level by using the repeater and editing it, but I didn't. I did that at the HTML level. So what else have we got here? We know that the lengths are enforced. I could check the lengths on everything else. I'm not going to do that. So what I'm always also interested in is things like this. If I have a look at this down here, what we've got is the gender is a set of radio buttons with values. So I've got values 1, I guess, and 2. So when this form is sent through and I want to make this employee female, the gender will be sent through with 2. Let me just check that. So I'm going to save that. Save. Now that was accepted and we've got a different URL. If I look at the post message for this, there's where's the gender? There's the gender. So I am going to check whether gender is enforced as a valid value. So if I put in gender 3, that's not one of the genders that's listed, and say go. So I know now that this is the error response. This will not have changed in any way. Male, female, that's fine. So one of the other things we've got here are drop downs. Drop downs are also very useful because, alright, can't select it in edit mode. Edit, select marital status, other. Let's have a quick look at what this is. So I'm looking at the values because I understand HTML, I'm looking to see what this is like. Now you saw in the gender it was 0 and 1, which suggests that internally there's a mapping between 1 to male and 2 to female on the back end. Here we've got strings. So this might be vulnerable to localization. This might be vulnerable to values that are not in the list. So I might be able to change this. And again, I'm just going to change this on, in fact, let's change it at the bottom end. So I'm going to put the intercept on. So I'm going to send this through, change myself to other. There's the intercepted request. But I'm not going to be other. I'm going to be Bob. So my marital status is going to be Bob. Let me forward that through. And that's interesting. So that's been accepted. We know that the refresh request, when it's not accepted, doesn't give me that employees thing. I can see in the response it's a refresh. So presumably now I have a marital status of Bob. But I can't check, right? Because it's not rendered as Bob through the front end because it's not in the list. Is that stored in the database? I don't know. If there was an API, I might be able to get the information back at an API level and view this in a different way. But I can't see the effect of what I just did at the technical levels that I'm working, because it's not coming through into the GUI. It's not coming through. Let's just double check. Here's the get that we do. Oh, there's the page. Is Bob in there? 0 matches. Bob. No. So I can't see whether that is reflected in the page, so I'm assuming it's not. It's come through. Let's see, has it actually come through as other? No, it's not come through as anything. Marital status. Marital status. None of them are selected. So do I have a marital status? I don't know. I'm now confused. So I found something that I really need help investigating. I don't know if that's in the database. I don't know if this is a problem. I can't actually check. But I do know that we got a different behavior from the backend. So the backend accepted that, didn't reject it as invalid. And we know that because of the message type that we got back, the response. So this has probably gone on for a while. You can see that I've built up a model of the application in my head. I haven't drawn the diagram. But I know that when I'm updating the details and it's a valid acceptance, then we get a refresh. When it's invalid, I see a page come back. So I know that the server is going through two different paths. Don't know why they've chosen to do that rather than just reflect error messages up here. I know that there is potentially a mismatch in validation rules for some types. Now, possibly nationality has the same effect because it's a drop-down. We know that radio buttons, or we don't know, we're assuming that all radio buttons may not have this pathology. Pathology I picked up from James Lindsay. He describes pathology. So I'm looking at what are common problems that might be present in here. Because if we handle drop-downs in that way, here perhaps other drop-downs have the same impact. Now I could go on further and then go, right, let me functionally check because what is interesting about the dates, if I look in the message here, date is sent through like that. So that makes me think, why is date being sent through like that? Perhaps I need to do some validation around date to see how that gets handled. There's probably some issues around dates. Let's have a look. It's date of birth. Normally that would be in the past, so let's date of birth in the future. If I still get intercept on, yes I do. Okay, so that's accepted. So that's a functional issue, not really a technical issue, but I was led to that by the technical information here that made me think, if that's coming through as a string, perhaps the validation isn't as rigorous on here as it could be. So this user with this odd name has not yet been born, but we can add them into the system. So hopefully you see some of the overlap between the technical thought processes, the risk-based thought processes, and the functionality, how I'm using the different levels of technical information to build a model and understand the system. Because that to me is a relatively concise example of using technical information and risk around that to do and conduct exploratory testing. And this is very often what I'll do when I'm doing security testing as well. I'll look at the system, I'll model it, then I'll see that messages are coming through. Then at this point, if I was resending this, I might try and resend some cross-site scripting, because this gets rendered on the front. And if there's cross-site scripting errors that come through because I'm in as an admin, that might be an issue. I might try and do some SQL injection, and I'll do all that at the typically the HTTP level, because then I can fuzz that in. But that is, for me, an example of what technical testing looks like. If there's stuff there you don't understand, then rewind it back, take the term that you don't understand in terms of, well, what's a proxy? What's an HTTP request? How do I use the dev tools? What does he mean by JavaScript event handling? How can we edit the DOM? What is the DOM? I don't understand the HTML that I'm seeing there. Any of that stuff, go and look it up, because that's how we learn to become more technical, just in tiny little chunks of things we do not understand about the technology. We look it up, we become more technical as a result. I'm not going to argue about what does technical mean or not, but to me it's related to this technology and the technical aspects of what we're doing, not the functional aspects, not the requirement aspects, the technical aspects associated with the implementation and the risk around that. Thanks for watching. This is probably longer than I expected. If you want more videos like this, let me know in comments. We do try and release videos that are technical, that are hands-on, that are how-tos, so subscribe to the channel if you want more, but thanks very much for sticking this out.